One day, the world was simple, like a small village, green fields, and the sounds of birds announcing the start of morning. But in a corner of England, a spark ignited that changed everything. It was not an ordinary fire, but the fire of steam and iron. From it emerged wheels, smoke, and factories that never slept. In the silence of the night, the sound of machines began to become the music of the new era. The earth transformed into a colossal workshop, and the sky into a cloud of soot. Men, women, and children came to live among the iron, chasing a living wage in never-ending clamor. Their dreams were simple, but life was not. This is the Industrial Revolution, the time when iron woke up and man slept. A journey that changed the face of history and redefined the meaning of work and the meaning of pain. And before we begin this journey, tell me, from which country are you following us now, and what time is it at this moment? In the mid-18th century, England looked like any quiet European country. People lived on agriculture, and the countryside was the heart of life. Horses slowly pulled carriages, and water turned the mills as they had done for centuries. No one could imagine that this calm was hiding an explosion that would change the world. In 1756, a man named James Watt began to develop a small steam engine. His idea was simple in appearance, but it was the key that opened the door to a new era. When that machine turned for the first time, its sound was different from anything people had heard, a sound like the exhale of a metal beast preparing to awaken. Small factories began to spread near rivers, because water was necessary to cool the steam and operate the gears. Soon, high chimneys extended across the horizon, spewing dense smoke. Cities no longer knew the smell of wet earth, but the smell of burnt coal. The night became gray, and the day was no longer clear as it once was. The fields began to empty of farmers after they were attracted by the promises of work in the new factories. There, in the heart of the nascent industrial cities, hope mixed with exhaustion. People saw the machines as an opportunity for a better life, but they did not yet realize that the machine would demand its price. London, Manchester, and Birmingham grew at an unprecedented speed. Small houses crowded around the factories, and the sound of hammers never stopped, night or day. Everything moved, everything changed, even time itself began to move at a speed unknown to humans before. In the streets, children ran barefoot through the smoke, carrying pieces of coal or transporting workers' tools. This was not yet exploitation, but the beginning of a new age whose features were not yet clear. People thought this was the bright future, and that steam would make life easier, but as the years passed, they would discover that smoke had another face. Thus was born the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, a dawn polluted with the smell of iron and coal, but it was the beginning of a world unlike what came before it. A dawn in which people did not witness the sunrise, but the rise of smoke. With the spread of these new machines, steam was no longer just an invention but became a spirit moving the world. And with every wheel that turned, another machine appeared, faster and greedier for human effort. And from here begins the next story, when the iron spoke. The steam spark was no longer just a strange experiment in a small workshop. In the decades that followed the mid-18th century, iron began to speak louder than ever before. The sounds of wheels, the whistles of locomotives, and the roar of presses became the new language the world spoke. Around 1780, the first large steam engines appeared inside major factories. Workers watched them with astonishment and fear at the same time, as they had never seen a machine move with such power before. For the first time, it became possible to produce enormous quantities of goods in a short time. Textiles, iron, and coal, everything became faster, cheaper, and more present in the markets. Then came the power loom, that invention which changed the face of the cloth industry in England. Previously, it relied on hand weaving, which required patience and precision. But now, machines wove in moments what used to take days. Dozens of looms gathered in vast halls buzzing with sound, and the worker became a part of the machine itself, standing among them like someone watching a creature of metal and fire. In the early 19th century, iron came out of the factory walls onto the roads. Steam locomotives appeared, and the railroads were born. In 1824, the first experimental journey of a locomotive pulling carriages full of coal and passengers set off. That moment was like magic. The ground shook, smoke rose, and the wheels made a music no one had heard before. People lined the sides of the road, clapping and cheering, between astonishment and joy. Time had begun to move at a new speed. But the iron did not speak alone, it dragged everything around it. Mines deepened further in search of coal, factories swelled, and other countries began to imitate what England had done. France, Germany, and then America, all entered the race. The whole world suddenly awoke to one sound, the sound of the machine. With this dazzling progress, the balance of life began to tilt little by little. Every minute was measured by production, and every movement was calculated at a price. Time was no longer for rest or contemplation, but for speed, precision, and achievement. Iron was not only speaking, but it was giving orders, and people obeyed. Steam had turned into the beating heart of the new era, and iron became its restless tongue. And amidst this clamor, man discovered that he had created something stronger than himself, something that could not be easily controlled. As the scope of industry expanded, cities began to grow aimlessly. People gathered around the factories, and houses rose as if chasing the smoke in the sky. Nature was no longer the same, and the air was no longer clean as before. Thus a new world was born, cities without sky. At the turn of the 19th century, British cities began to grow at a speed unknown to history. Green fields slowly disappeared under layers of brick and smoke, and quiet villages turned into crowded, sleepless cities. This growth was not natural but more like a massive urban explosion driven by the new factories that filled the horizon. In Manchester, the chimneys rose so high they covered the sky. In Liverpool, the ports turned into forests of sails and goods arriving from everywhere. As for Sheffield, it became known as the City of Steel, where people heard nothing but the sound of the hammer on iron. Every city became a giant factory that lived, breathed, and emitted smoke. The smoke covered the streets like a thick fog that would not leave. When the rain fell, it did not clean the earth but turned it into black mud full of coal residue. Windows were dusty, and the rivers changed color from clarity to ash. Even the smell of the air was no longer like anything from the past, a mixture of iron, coal, and moisture. The number of people increased beyond what the old cities could bear. In the narrow alleys, small, cramped houses were built, with little light entering. Entire families lived in one room, sleeping on a cold floor and waking up to the noise of nearby factories. At night, when everyone slept, the sound of the machines behind the walls did not cease, as if the city itself did not know sleep. The streets filled with vendors, workers, and carts laden with coal and cotton. Horses grew tired, and the wheels groaned over the stones, but no one stopped. Everything was moving fast towards the unknown. People walked with heads bowed, they had no time to look at the sky, because it simply could not be seen. In the evening, the orange lights emanating from the factory windows colored the fog with a strange hue, like an inverted dawn. The city looked alive, but in reality, it was gasping from exhaustion. It no longer resembled a home inhabited by people, but a huge machine in which people lived. Gardens disappeared, birds left, and nature became outside the city limits. Man became part of a system with no place for rest. In those years, between 1810 and 1850, the face of England changed completely. It was no longer clear where the countryside ended and the city began, as chimneys rose in every direction, announcing that the new era was forcefully imposing itself. The cities were breathing with difficulty, but no one was thinking of stopping. Everyone was busy with production, money, and the race toward tomorrow. No one knew that behind this apparent prosperity, there were pains waiting in the heart of darkness, pains that the gears of the factories and the dust of the mines would reveal when we get closer to the lives of those who carried this era on their shoulders. Thus, while the cities were growing and becoming more clamorous, there was another world inside them that no one saw, the world of workers, children, and women who lived between iron and fire. In that dark world, there was no dawn and no rest, but endless work and heavy silence. There, under the wheels, the next story begins. Between the tireless factory chimneys and the roar of the machines that filled the sky, the lives of the workers revolved in an endless cycle. From the first dawn until long after dark, the working hours stretched as if forever. And in the middle of this iron world, thousands of children, women, and men lived a bitter struggle against exhaustion, hunger, and danger. In the early 19th century, children became part of the daily scene in the factories. They were 8 or 9 years old, small enough to crawl between the gears and pipes to clean them. Their small hands slipped between the sharp cogs, and many lost fingers in a single moment. There were no schools for them, no games, and no sunlight they knew. The day for them began with the factory whistle and ended with its sound again. As for the mines, the tragedy was more brutal. The young crawled into the depths of the earth, carrying oil lamps, dragging coal carts on their hands and feet. The air was suffocating, and moisture clung to their clothes, and sometimes rocks suddenly collapsed, swallowing small bodies no one remembered. Their wages were meager, barely enough for food, but need was harsher than fear. Adults were no better off. Men spent their lives in furnaces and foundries where the fire never went out, and women stood for long hours in spinning and weaving factories, wrapping threads with threads of their sweat and patience. The constant standing in deafening noise and dust filling their chests exhausted their bodies, but their hands did not stop, for every minute meant a simple wage that fed an entire family. In those years between 1820 and 1850, work reached its peak. There were no laws protecting workers' rights, and no one asked about their age or health. The factory was everything: home, school, and destiny. It was normal to see a child sleeping on a pile of cloth near a spinning machine, or a man continuing to work despite a bleeding injury. No one stopped, because whoever stopped was replaced by another. Yet, despite all this suffering, there was a small, unquenched sparkle in people's hearts. Mothers smiled at their children despite the fatigue, and men exchanged light jokes between work shifts, as if confronting the iron with laughter. But behind those pale faces, there were souls searching for mercy that was lost amid the smoke. The Industrial Revolution, despite its glory, was a cruel time for man. Under the wheels, and inside the mines and factories, workers paid the price of progress with their sweat, tears, and years of life. As time passed, some began to secretly wonder, is justice possible? Does anyone hear our voices amidst this clamor? And while throngs of workers were bleeding with exhaustion in the depths of the cities, above them, other men were watching the smoke from their high windows, calculating profits and smiling at a future they saw as theirs alone. There, on the other side of the city, begins the next story, the story of the iron and money barons. While the workers toiled in the depths of the factories and mines, on the other side of the city, other men were quickly ascending to the top, men whose faces were not stained with coal, but who reaped fortunes from every speck of dust those workers breathed. In those years, a new generation of wealthy individuals was born, a generation later known as the industry barons. In the first half of the 19th century, new names began to shine in the sky of Britain: owners of textile factories in Manchester, iron refineries in Sheffield, and railway financiers in London. Each of them saw the machine as a path to gold, not just a tool for production. Every extra minute of work and every new hand in the factory meant a greater profit. And while people were counting the hours, those barons were counting the profits. Palaces were built on the outskirts of cities with vast gardens and high walls. The clear glass in their windows and the marble on their floors were the product of the workers' sweat themselves. And in the evening, when the weary slept on the cold ground, the tables in the wealthy men's palaces were filled with food, candles, and music. Two worlds lived in the same place, but between them was a distance not measured in meters but by absent justice. During that period, a new term appeared: businessman, a person who works not with his hands but with his mind, money, and investments. Money began to move freely between cities, transforming from a means of living to a means of control. Banks financed projects, factories expanded, and the railroad connected cities, and everything revolved around one word: profit. Between 1840 and 1860, the fortunes of these men doubled in a way history had never known before. England in those years was the heart of the industrial world and the center of trade and finance. Its ships carried goods to all continents, and gold returned to it from everywhere. But with all this wealth, poverty was also increasing, and the prosperity of the few required the brokenness of the many. From this paradox, a new idea was born that would change the face of the economy, that the market is stronger than the government, and that profit is a justification for everything. No one was yet talking about justice or equality, as the laws protected property for the owners. Money became the language of the age, and whoever did not know it was excluded from life. But history does not forgive long silence. From amidst the noise and smoke, faint voices began to rise, voices speaking of injustice, of wages, and of the human being who became his own shadow. These voices were weak at first, but they would grow and change everything. At the time when the wealthy thought the world had settled for them, deep inside the factories, men and women were planning something different, for words never heard before about justice, dignity, and the right to life. And from those faint whispers, voices in the dark would soon be born. Silence had reigned over the factories for long years, the sound of the machines covered everything, even the sound of man himself. But gradually, this silence began to crack slowly, like an old wall tired of carrying injustice. In the first half of the 19th century, the workers' lives revolved in a closed circle: work, then sleep, then work again. But they began to feel that what was happening was not their destiny but a system that could be changed. And with every whispered conversation in the dark, a new idea was born. Around 1830, the first labor societies began to appear in major British cities. They were not yet legal, and joining them was a real risk that could mean imprisonment or dismissal from work. Nevertheless, people gathered in old pubs and churches, talking about justice, wages, and the long hours that stole their lives. They called themselves the Brothers, as if confronting the unforgiving machine together. In Manchester, the first peaceful gatherings emerged. Thousands of men and women walked in the same work clothes, carrying banners on which they wrote simple words: "We want to live." But the police dispersed them violently, and some were injured and killed. Since that day, no one forgot that moment. People understood that the path to change would not be easy, but it had already begun. With increasing awareness, a new thought appeared that explained what was happening to the world in a different language. In 1848, a book was published that would cause a stir throughout Europe. Its title was the Communist Manifesto, written by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. They were two young men angry at the injustice they saw every day. They wrote about the workers who produced everything but owned nothing, and about the wealthy who grew richer the more others suffered. Their words were bold, but they found an echo in the hearts of millions. The idea of labor unions began to spread like a quiet fire, and in the 1850s, governments began to gradually recognize them under pressure from reality. Workers gained someone to negotiate on their behalf, and the weak voice gained an echo that could be heard from afar. Things did not change overnight, but the wheel of history began to turn in a new direction. The first strikes were met with force, but with every new strike, the fear decreased. Workers realized that their strength was not in money but in their number and their unity. For the first time, it was no longer the factory giving the orders, but the worker who had the word "enough." In those years, the shape of British society changed slowly. Parliament began to discuss new laws, including limiting working hours and banning child labor in mines and factories. These were small steps, but they were the beginning toward a more equitable world. People proved that a voice, however faint, is capable of breaking the wall of silence if it continues to resonate. These voices born in the dark were the nucleus of the change that would shape the face of the industrial world for decades to come. The Industrial Revolution planted the seeds of pain, but from the womb of this pain, hope was born. And as the years passed, those voices grew and spread until they could no longer be stopped. But while the shouts filled the streets, a new light was looming on the horizon, the light of electricity, steel, and inventions that would open a new chapter in human history. There begins the next stage of the story. In the second half of the 19th century, the world stood on the threshold of a new chapter in its history. After smoke covered the skies of cities and man learned how to tame iron and steam, another spark began to light up the horizons, the spark of light. The second revolution was different from the first. It no longer revolved around coal and engines but around electricity, steel, and oil. This time, the changes were not limited to England alone but extended to Europe, America, and the entire world. The earth itself seemed to be breathing a new speed, and minds did not stop discovering. Around 1870, what can be called the beginning of the age of steel appeared. This strong metal replaced the old iron and allowed the construction of tall bridges and buildings. Cities began to rise toward the sky, and with them rose the ambitions of man himself. Everything became possible thanks to this metal that neither rusted nor softened. Then came electricity, the greatest gift that changed the shape of night forever. In 1877, the inventor Thomas Edison registered the patent for the electric light bulb. For the first time, candles went out in the streets of New York, and electric lights lit up the windows. People went out at night just to look with astonishment at the new light, as if seeing a small day being born from the heart of darkness. It was only a few years before factories began to use electricity instead of steam, to work faster and longer without stopping. The oil wealth began to emerge from the depths of the earth. A black liquid that would change the shape of the world forever. Oil began to be used to run engines and generate power, and soon its value surpassed gold itself. In America, Russia, and the Middle East, new races began for control over it. Oil became the heart of the new era, feeding every machine, every city, and every coming war. As for transportation, the miracle was even greater, fast trains and steamships crossing the oceans. In 1869, the work on the Transcontinental Railroad in America was completed, connecting the East with the West and turning the continent into one interconnected world. Years later, metal ships began crossing the Atlantic in days instead of weeks. The world became smaller, closer, and more connected than ever before. In 1876, Graham Bell invented the telephone, and sound traveled distances as never before. A few years later, the first global telegraph networks appeared, connecting continents with an underwater cable. For the first time in history, news was heard instantly, not after months of waiting. The world became an interconnected village, even though it did not yet know the word globalization. All these discoveries made man feel that he was approaching perfection. The 19th century was about to end, and the world was gleaming as if it had been reborn. Cities lit up, factories became smarter, and scientists spoke confidently of a coming century without ignorance or poverty. But behind this brilliance, there were still unanswered questions. Can man keep up with this progress, and will the machine remain his servant, or will it one day become his master? The second revolution was a promise of prosperity, but it was also the beginning of an era of competition between nations. Every country wanted to be the strongest, and every inventor wanted to outpace time. The world entered an endless race, a race between light and shadow, between man and what his hands created. As this race intensified, signs of fatigue began to reappear. Cities grew more than they should, factories became greedier, and people lived faster than they could feel. And from here begins a different phase, the phase in which we will reveal the hidden price of progress. With the dawn of the 20th century, the world seemed brighter than ever. Cities twinkled with lights, trains moved at a speed no one had dreamed of, and inventions followed one another every day like miracles. But beneath this brilliance, there was an unseen price, a price not paid with money, but with the soul. Life changed faster than man could adapt. The day became longer than necessary, and the night shorter than it should be. People no longer knew silence, every moment was filled with the sound of an engine, a whistle, or endless noise. The whole world seemed to be running, but no one knew where. In large cities like London, Paris, and New York, tall buildings rose, and the streets were filled with cars and electric carriages. But in the back alleys, houses were crowded with poor families who did not benefit from this progress. Dirt accumulated in the rivers, and the sky drowned in factory smoke, even the rain became black, carrying the smell of iron and gas. Nature itself began to groan, as if tiring of man. Pollution was not the only price. The man who created all this began to feel like a stranger in the world he built. He lived among machines more than among people, in factories, offices, and noisy cities. He lost his sense of calm and belonging. He became merely a number in a record or a cog in a massive system that knew no mercy. Even the faces in the streets became similar, moving without meeting eyes. In that era, a new term appeared, alienation. Thinkers wrote about it sadly and fearfully, the feeling that man had become distant from himself, and that the things he built with his own hands had begun to control him. What is the use of light if it extinguishes the warmth of the heart? And what is the use of speed if it robs us of the ability to stop? With the increase in factories and mines, illness began to crawl silently among the workers, diseases of the lungs, skin, and bones as a result of smoke, dust, and heavy metals. Medicine at that time was not able to save everyone, and death was a natural part of the work cycle. All of this was happening in the background while the world celebrated progress and invention. In modern homes, rooms were filled with new appliances, the light bulb, the telephone, the radio, and then the car. But something disappeared from people's lives, simplicity. Neighbors no longer knew each other, and the night was no longer for rest but for completing work. Even the child no longer played in the street as he used to but was surrounded by noise from all sides. The world was entering the age of the machine, and the machine, in turn, was entering the heart of man. With all this change, a new idea began to form in the collective consciousness, that progress is not free, and that behind every achievement is a bill paid not with money but with balance and tranquility. Man learned how to control fire, but he did not learn how to control his ambition. As the years passed, wars began to approach, carrying with them the fruits of this development, planes, cannons, and poisonous gases. Everything man created to raise his standard of living returned to threaten his existence. The world entered the 20th century gleaming with light, but carrying within it a long shadow of danger. Man got what he wanted, comfort, speed, and power, but in return, he lost something no less valuable, peace. Thus, after a century of steam, iron, and invention, the world paused to ask, was all this worth it? As we enter a new era, the Industrial Revolution is no longer just history but a living legacy that still exists in everything we see and touch. With the beginning of the 20th century, the world had changed completely, but the effects of the Industrial Revolution had not disappeared, they merely wore new clothes. The iron that was forged in the old factories became part of everything we touch today, from cars to bridges, and from planes to the phones we carry in our hands. The revolution left its mark on every corner of modern human life. In 1937, the first metal bridges extended across vast rivers in America and Europe. And in the two world wars, iron turned into a formidable weapon, reminding humanity that what was created for construction can also be used for destruction. But after the wars ended and cities began to be rebuilt from the ashes, iron returned again, towering skyscrapers, more efficient factories, and networks connecting the world as never before. Science progressed at an astonishing speed, the electric motor, the airplane, the car, then the computer, and the internet. All these inventions were nothing but a direct extension of that spark that ignited centuries ago in England. The steam that powered the wheels is today the idea that moves minds. The world has become one village, but that village is still inhabited by the same old contradictions, between rich and poor, between work and rest, between man and machine. The shape of the smoke changed, but it did not disappear. The factories changed, but they still run non-stop. And the worker changed, but he still sells his time and effort to live. The Industrial Revolution is what gave birth to the age of electricity, then electronics, and then artificial intelligence. Every modern machine carries within it the echo of the first hammer, the smell of old coal, and the sweat of the worker who began the journey more than 2 centuries ago. In the end, the Industrial Revolution was not just a chapter in history, but the beginning of a story that is still being written, the story of man who dreamed of controlling iron and ended up becoming a part of it. Nevertheless, hope remains, for as long as a heart beats within us and a voice remembers, the humanity that ignited the first spark will not be extinguished. Thus we reach the end of the journey, from smoke to light, and from steam to artificial intelligence. But the questions remain the same: where is man going, and how much must he pay for what he calls progress? We may not have all the answers, but we know that behind every machine, every tower, and every invention, there is always a human who once stood at the dawn of smoke, dreaming only of living a life.